How has the devaluation of the rupee affected imports and exports to the country? Are we on the right track in terms of achieving a 7.2 economic growth by the end of 2012? To discuss issues relating to the current status of the economy, we have with us this evening Professor S.T. Kavaratna, the Dean of the Management and Finance Faculty of the Colombo University. Good evening. Starting off, Professor, tell me, what is your take on the current status of the economy?
The Sri Lankan economy, after the war, has been doing well. The economic growth rate was about over 6%, 6 to 8%, and the infrastructure development was the main program they have followed. And of course, we are in the open economic policy package where the trade liberalization should take place. And of course, we know that export promotion is the only solution for everything under the liberalized economy.
Now, Professor, in my earlier question you mentioned that the country's economy took a great stride forward following the end of the conflict. However, we did not see FDIs rushing into the country during this particular period in question. Now, what was the reason for you to tell me, Professor, that the economy of the country took a great stride forward?
Yeah, the FDI, of course, is not dependent on only the peace. Of course, we need infrastructure facilities as well as, foreign investors. They are thinking about what kind of profit they can generate from Sri Lanka. Particularly, you see, we don't have massive cheap labor in Sri Lanka, and we don't have enough all infrastructure facilities, and our market is very small. Unlike they are coming and seeking the Indian market, or like that way, we can't expect FDI to increase very short period. If we have good policy package in future, we can increase FDI, maybe like tourism industry or like service industries. Sri Lanka has, I hope, more competitive
do we have the right policies in place, Professor, to attract foreign investors to the country?
Yeah, policies, of course, are changing. The main blame for Sri Lankan system having always changing the policies. Policy consistency is more important, because formulation of policy is one thing, changing policy quite often is another thing. So the conventional blame for Sri Lankan economy is coming that we are changing policies very quickly. So policy consistency is essential.
What is the reason behind this, Professor? You are telling me that policy consistency is very important, and Sri Lanka is looking at massive economic growth in the coming few years or so, probably a double-digit growth. And Sri Lanka has a vision of making the country the miracle of Asia by 2016 as well. What is the reason for not having policy consistency when we have so much of goals in this country at present?
Yeah, the thing that, external pressure coming or the internal problems arising can change the policy consistency. The external policy, of course, when the global world market oil price going up or the food crisis are there are a lot of financial issues, financial crisis emerging in USA. There are a lot of issues, and internally also, when there is a tsunami or when there is regional development taking place or the resettlement taking place, that can be. But the important thing, like for example, taxation, in fact, the income tax we reform. That income tax system is now going on, but other taxes should be considered with the economic balances.
Professor, when making the 2012 budget, you mentioned that there was a crisis in Europe, there was a crisis in the US for that matter. Was all these issues taken into account by the government when formulating the 2012 budget?
You see that some unexpected things we can't focus, like for example, the oil price change. But when government prepare, it should be focused, but unexpected things also can happen. Now, particularly world crude oil prices, we can't predict where it will be. Some economists say that it can go.
But there are things that we can predict, Professor. Let's say, example, for a fact we know that by May 20th, Sri Lanka should stop importing oil from Iran. So this could be predicted, this could be forecasted. What measures must the government take in light of things that could be predicted? That's my question to you, Professor.
Yeah, that's very important thing. You see, if we can predict, we have to take actions when we select the policy options.
Are we taking the right actions, Professor?
Yeah, we. In fact, when it comes to the devaluation, I believe it's a right action because you know, at this juncture.
We'll talk about the devaluation in a moment. Just tell me about the oil prices, the issues relating to the international markets, and is Sri Lanka really gearing up to face these challenges in the future?
Yeah, that of course linked to the energy policy in the country, where you know, all whole economic decisions will depend on the energy policy. Now, cost of living, why rising? Because we have designed many activities based on the oil-based technology, transportation, or electricity generation, or any other services you can see. Even if you take a mobile phone call, which has linked to oil importation today. Why? Because you have to charge your mobile phone with the help of electricity. 80% of electricity is produced with the help of the imported gas and oil or gas turbine. So that you see the important thing, our energy structure, we have to shift from the imported oil to the any other alternative methods.
Professor, has the Sri Lankan government really exploited other markets? We are totally dependent on our garment industry to Europe. Europe is currently facing a huge crisis at present as far as the economy is concerned. You know, the US is also facing a huge crisis at present, and they're facing an election later this year as well. So there are shifts in policy as far as the world is concerned. Do you think the Sri Lankan government has really exploited the markets elsewhere, especially India, China for that matter?
Still, I can't see such movement, but you know, the most important thing, the emerging markets, as you cited, the China and India. India is the closest of us. So we have to do a thorough discussion, thorough understanding, thorough projections on what needs Indian market or what needs the Chinese market, what can we supply from Sri Lanka. So these things we have to go in depth and do kind of a consistent long-run policy designing.
Do you think the government is doing enough as far as this aspect is concerned?
I think government should more focus about that. Government is doing, but government more focus going into infrastructure development and the north and east rehabilitation and resettlements. But meanwhile, the export promotion, I don't think that since 1977, government focus was on export promotion. Though we introduced trade liberalization policies, of course, gradually we had the garment sector expansion. Apart from that, people went abroad and remittances became the main source of income. Apart from that, I can't understand why governments are not much focusing on export industries, exporting other type of exports. We have to diversify exports. We have to think about the alternative exports to these markets. Still, I haven't seen any government giving the highest priority for the exporting sector.
How do you view the role of the private sector in this context?
That's also very important. You see, that role of private sector is depend on where the profitability lies. So in case of Sri Lanka, the profitability is not in exporting sector. That has been the basic issue, because if private sector organizations take any contract from government, infrastructure development, resettlement, local works, they can earn more profit rather than producing and exporting. If you export today, the main thing, the internal cost is rising, the external shocks are there, so it's not easy to get higher profit in exporting sector. So the private sector reluctant to export, but they are willing to do the domestic works. This is the main thing. If we want to increase the private sector participation in exports, we have to essentially justify the profit.
Is the government really serious about private investments? All this and more with Professor S.D. Kawaratna, the Dean of the Management and Finance Faculty of the Columbia University, right after this commercial break. Welcome back to BizFirst in Focus. Professor, before the break we were talking about the role of the private sector in today's business world. I want to know, is the government really serious about private investments locally?
Yeah, I think in the case of tax reform, they concern that. because when they introduced the tax reform, they thought about that private sector is the main engine of growth. But with respect to the price hike, or the what we call production cost is rising, I don't think that the present situation is desirable for private sector.
The government, a minister of the government, has been pressing on the fact that the private sector is the engine of growth in the country's economy. However, when you look at the past, you look at the Expropriation Act which was passed in Parliament, when you look at the manner in which prices have been fluctuating in the world market, as far as oil is concerned, as far as the dollar is concerned, the private sector seems somewhat neglected at the present context. What are your thoughts about this, Professor? You are the Dean of the Management and Finance Faculty of the Columbia University. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, my understanding is the government sector also has a role in the economy. So how government make market so efficient is the question. Market should be the efficient. So the market will be efficient with the help of private sector driven growth. Private sector should be the leader, but market functioning with the government guidelines. So government should lead market where the private sector fail, or the private sector missing sectors. Some areas, if there's no private sector, if private sector is not at all or missing, government can play a bigger role.
Professor, is the government really acting based on the whims and fancies of the International Monetary Fund? Is that why the current situation, the current tax reforms are taking a drastic turn, cutting off subsidies are taking a drastic turn in the country? Is the government really acting based on the whims and fancies of the International Monetary Fund?
I don't think, because you see what happened very recently, the exchange rate devaluation taking place. So when exchange rate devaluated, I can remember one day in last week or previous week, where 2 o'clock it was about 125, 27, and the evening it went close to 130. So such drastic devaluation is taking place. Any government should take a decision. And on the other hand, there was a serious problem that in the world market, the crude oil price going on.
Let's take a look at the last couple of days, Professor. I don't want to go back many years or so, but let's take a look at the last couple of days alone. Now, last week the government brought in a very drastic turn as far as vehicle tax was concerned, importation of vehicle tax was concerned. Right after that, a couple of days later, you see the IMF granting its 8th tranche to the country after the 7th review. Any connectivity you see on this premise?
What I feel that with respect to vehicles, I have my own idea. In Sri Lankan context, you see, every day new 500 vehicles are registered. So we need more oil, crude oil, for the new vehicles. And if you take, for example, light cars, per week there are about 700 light cars imported from India per week. So in that way, if we go, if you compare, for example, last year...
What are we trying to do, Professor? Are we trying to take somewhat revenge from another country, especially India, for just voting against Sri Lanka at the UN
my
resolution?
Basic argument coming is, how can we afford for the growing consumption of the oil?
Does it make sense? Does it make sense, Professor, when you really look at how things are working out in the country? You talk about giving a good livelihood to the people. However, such a tax is somewhat going to affect the normal, ordinary person. Because
I don't think the importation of vehicle tax will affect the normal people. The basic issue coming there, you see the import bill is rising while the export income is constant or very slowly growing. So how can we fill this gap? There's a basic question, because import expenditure going up and up. If you compare the last year first half and this year first half,
so you mean to say, Professor, that this was the right move taken by the government? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, of course, when it comes to automobile taxation, I believe that, because you see, otherwise what will happen, the consumption of oil will make about 100% of our imported income, imported expenditure.